Alright guys, it looks like the Saviors of Uldum meta is starting to settle a little bit. We're getting some signs that the best decks are rising to the top, and there's data to actually support that already. So we're going to take a look at currently the 7 best decks in this new early meta.
Hey buddy, watch this.
Yeah, so in this video, I'll be walking you through 7 decks, and I've arranged them in order of their hsreplay.net meta rankings right now, so we'll just go from number 1 down to number 7. Lots of new decks here and new archetypes to discuss, which is pretty exciting, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So up first here is a deck you're probably not going to want to see. It is Control Warrior. And it's not that different than what we're used to, the deck that's been at the top of the meta really for a while now. It's mostly the same package driven by Dr. Boom Mad Genius and his army of mechs, and he even got some new mechs with Tomb Warden, as you'll see there in the background. But also some fun new hand buff taunt stuff like Armagadillo actually made the cut, although not into the fray. But also Frightened Flunky, just a good enough card to make this list, alongside Restless Mummy, which is just a great early to mid game rush minion that can take some fantastic trades. So I don't know, 5 or 6 new cards, something like that in this list, but the same shell. So it's playing exactly like it used to, essentially just stay alive, play Dr. Boom, and overwhelm your opponent with lots of value and lots of rushing mechs to keep the board in check until eventually they just kind of give up in self-despair. We also got Plague of Wrath in there as a new removal option, which is fun with things like Warpath, or particularly Dr. Boom's hero power that does 1 damage to all enemies. That's a great setup there. So some neat new stuff, particularly Armagadillo is a really fun card, but nothing revolutionary here, nothing too surprising, and it doesn't really shift the way the deck plays all that much. So still on top, a little bit sad about that, but the rest of this video is going to feature some pretty awesome new deck archetypes and lots of new cards. So moving on to number 2 here, we have Murloc Paladin, and these names do come, by the way, from HS Replay's names for these decks. I would probably be a little bit more specific with some of these, like Tip the Scales Paladin, for instance, to really focus in on the key component of this deck, which of course is Tip the Scales and Prismatic Lens and the interaction between those cards. So the idea with this deck is you play a Prismatic Lens early in the game, as early as you can, and hopefully you swap a Tip the Scales with a really cheap Murloc. Most of your Murlocs, of course, 1 to 3 mana, and you can then play a Tip the Scales on like turn 4 if you had the coin, or turn 5 or 6 sometimes. And that's just going to build this giant board of Murlocs, and some decks just don't have answers to that, so you overwhelm them with just onboard stats. If they do have that mid-game board clear option for the Tip the Scales play, then this deck can actually go late and do some crazy stuff with things like Chef Nomi, or just chip away at your health total over time using charge minions and True Silver Champions until eventually you just can't quite keep up. So a couple different win conditions here. Also, Zephrys the Great is in this list, which is pretty crazy because you're thinning your deck out so fast with these Tip the Scales that Zephrys actually comes online fairly consistently. And again, if you go late enough to get to those Chef Nomi scenarios or you're fatiguing, Zephrys also works there and can just give you some ridiculous damage output, right? So often helps you find that finishing piece of burst damage, or sometimes things like Bloodlust as well if you have a big board of Murlocs. So all in all, a surprisingly cool little deck that came together in a way I didn't expect it to. That interaction between Prismatic Lens and Tip the Scales surprised me, and I think a lot of people. Beyond that, it was not a highly rated card. So pretty cool to see this. Now, I don't know if the deck's particularly fun to play against. That's a little bit of a problem. I think Prismatic Lens might be the sort of thing that's actually up for a nerf, because it can just create some really unfun scenarios, particularly with this deck having a super high win rate right now. We'll see how it evolves over time, but it might be a problem, maybe not too, so we'll just have to keep an eye on it, but definitely a new way to play Murloc Paladin. So moving on to the 3rd best list here, we have what HS Replay is calling Freeze Mage. I don't know if that's the perfect name. I would call it maybe like Big Mage or Big Spell Mage or Pocket Galaxy Mage, probably something a little different, maybe even Control Mage, although it doesn't play like a traditional control deck here because it has some pretty crazy ways to generate lots of pressure. You've got the classic Khadgar Conjurer's Calling package in there. You've got Luna's Pocket Galaxy shenanigans, making things like Alexstrasza, Kalecgos, and King Phaoris all cost 1 mana. And then you've got Feoris in your list too for cards like Power of Creation, Puzzle Box of Yogg-Saron, even some Blizzards in there to occasionally summon you a giant board. So a handful of different ways for this deck to create tons of positive pressure with big giant stuff. And although it doesn't actually have Mountain Giants, which is a little bit weird, and no Mana Cyclone package, it just shifts all of that power more towards the mid to late game. I think this deck is unfortunately creating pretty negative experiences right now thanks to Luna's Pocket Galaxy. A lot of people are already calling for a Pocket Galaxy nerf because it feels like it's a tad difficult to play against, and just like if they draw it, they win, and if they don't, maybe they don't win, which creates these really binary states in Hearthstone. I'm not willing to go that far just yet. I think we need to keep an eye on things, but let's wait and see. But this deck is definitely a lot of fun with the double puzzle box. All kinds of shenanigans are afoot with this one. So if you like a more late game style, if you like big crazy stuff, this is definitely a deck you should check out. Moving on here to Highlander Hunter, a deck I 100% did not expect to see on this list. I still don't even believe this. I know it's winning a lot of games and it has a good win rate, so clearly it's doing something right, but my brain just can't accept the fact that Zephrys and Bran are worth giving up so many good Hunter cards and consistency. Trump and other people will tell you otherwise, so trust them because apparently the data's in and I'm wrong. I guess I have some cognitive dissonance on this one I just can't overcome because this deck is working really well. It's number 4 right now. People are playing it to Legend, I see all the time. And it turns out Bran's pretty amazing for 7, and maybe more importantly, Zephrys can just do some ridiculous stuff. And this secret package is really good early game, and then you've also got Subject 9 to help you thin through your deck to find some of your key stuff, like your Zul'jins and your Brands and your Zephrys. So any sort of restrictions on finding what you need are limited a little bit in a list like this, thanks to the help of those sorts of thinning options. You've also got things like Hunter's Pack, just generating you a lot of cards. So if you do get a little light on stuff, you've got some options to just refill. There's some random mechs in here. It's just kind of all the best cards Hunter has access to. Is no huge surprises there. Zul'jin wins you some games, right? Bran wins you some games. Hyena Alpha wins you some games occasionally. So just a lot of powerful stuff that you can do, and eventually that's good enough. And still surprised by it, but this list wins. And if you want to use your Zephrys, if you got a Dynatamer Bran, it looks like this one's going to work out really nicely for now. I'm still doubtful it's going to last forever, but I think I'm going to end up being wrong. So go play some Highlander Hunter. Have fun despite my protests. So moving on here, the 5th best deck, we've got Quest Paladin. Although not a card I rated super high early on pre-expansion, after playing it in the Theory Crafting livestream, not too surprised here. Making Mummies felt pretty good, especially when you get to these big mid-game threats like Mechano Eggs and Mechanical Whelps and Da Undertaker. You can create some pretty crazy stuff with this hero power, and activating hero power is not that difficult. There's some decent Reborn options out there. You can see this list doesn't run an excessive number of Reborn stuff, but it still gets there, and it doesn't do it while sacrificing its curve, which was my biggest concern for Reborn, was that it would have to run a lot of bad cards in order to get the quest done. It turns out there's a pretty good balance, right, where you don't have to run that many bad cards. I'd say most of the Reborn stuff here you're okay with. Maybe you don't love Candletaker, maybe you don't love Ancestral Guardian, but they're not by any means big sacrifices in a list like this, and they still feel like they do okay sorts of things. But then you've also got this mech package propping it up, Micro Mummy kind of fusing those two worlds together, so things like Kangors are still powerful. And what that means is you've got a deck here that can both play in the early game with some stuff, thanks to those Mermy openers and Questing Explorers and Micro Mummies for your early game plays, but then you've also got that follow-up with big threats. So decks that run a lot of removal can eventually just run out of stuff, and you can start to outvalue with your hero power as long as you can hit the right sorts of targets. And that fuses an aggressive deck with a mid-range deck into a really nice package here that's working out obviously rather well because it's currently top 5 deck. So moving on here to our number 6 deck, we have what is being called Aggro Warrior. And this is basically driven, I think, by Bloodsorn Mercenary. New card, of course, allows you to create a copy of a damaged minion. And this deck has a lot of ways to damage stuff thanks to Inner Rage and Cruel Taskmaster. So Bloodsworn Mercenary can create some pretty silly plays by maybe just copying something valuable on board, or maybe copying an Inner Rage Leroy for tons of burst damage, right? So this one does play pretty fast and aggressively, and although maybe it doesn't start out quite as fast on the board as something like Pirate Warrior used to do back in the days, it has a lot of follow-up burst damage. So sometimes it just gets there over the top of other decks, alongside some pretty powerful, just nice tempo stuff like Livewire Lance. Get some lackeys, you take some trades, maybe you just hit your opponent in the face, but it's feeling like a good play. And then you've also got some damage synergy cards like your Amani Berserker, your new Temple Berserker, of course, Frothing Berserker, so some ways to utilize these damage style effects for extra bonuses. And then just some mid-game rush tempo style stuff, right? Militia Commander, Restless Mummy, both great options at turn 4 to help you swing back a board so that you can set up for those late game pushes with your Leroys or your Groms. All in all, this is a pretty fun archetype to play. I've had mixed success with it so far, but I think this deck will fall a little bit in the future, but will remain a fringe tier 2, maybe tier 3 list for people who want to play Warrior and surprise their opponents on ladder when they're expecting control. Maybe they mulligan for Dr. Boom Mad Genius, and instead you just smork them in the face with this list instead. And then finally here, my number 7 list is a Zoo Warlock, and we've already talked about this one a fair bit here on this channel, but essentially it's much like the Zoo Warlocks we've always known and loved in Hearthstone, very fast minion style of play. Build a board early, leverage that board, and overwhelm your opponent. But this one utilizes those new tools, Evil Recruiter, Neferset Thrasher, and Diseased Vulture to great effect, creating just very powerful early to mid game plays. That turn 3, turn 4, turn 5 kind of line on Zoo can overwhelm right now. If your opponent doesn't have an answer, you're just going to crush them and destroy them and win the game. But you're also complemented by, you know, the standard Zoo stuff we've seen lately, like Magic Carpet, that can create some really big plays. This particular list that is currently the most popular is running Dark Pharaoh Takan. I think most lists at this point are actually cutting Takan. I've seen more Sea Giant sort of stuff taking success in this world, and I like that too. I think Takan's actually a little slow. You like playing your lackeys, you like killing your lackeys. So Takan, surprisingly, despite looking like an obvious synergy, I think is falling a little off when it comes to synergies. But for now, this is the most popular list on HS Replay, and it's certainly still working fine. You can make Takan work nicely if you've got one and you want to play him. You're not going to lose too much efficiency there, but I think he will eventually end up being cut from the kind of final versions of this list. That said, it's Zoo, it's reliable, it's super fun with Neferset Thrasher and Disease Vulture. Like, this deck gets way more enjoyable for me, so if you've always wanted to play some Zoo, you got these cards laying around, probably a fairly cheap list to craft, and certainly still a powerful one on the ladder right now. And there you go, guys. Those are the top 7 decks currently on the hsreplay.net meta report. Hopefully me talking through them gave you a little bit of guidance on what they do and what they're all about. Hopefully some value add there for you guys. There are obviously more good decks in Saviors of Uldum that are playable that weren't on this list. I just used 7 as a breakpoint because I didn't want to go all the way to 10. But there are more good decks. We will probably find even more good decks in the future as well. There's usually 1 or 2 surprises that come down a little later that somebody solves. Also, these aren't going to be the final lists for these decks. I'm sure there will be refinements here and there. Things like Murloc Paladin might stay pretty standardized, but there are going to be other changes to these lists as we find the optimized things. So you can go ahead and craft these probably. It looks like these are going to be fairly stable parts of the meta, but don't come yelling at me if something falls out of play that you spent some dust on. There are still shakeups coming. All that said, curious what decks have been working for you guys. Leave your thoughts in the comments on what's been working for you. Thank you so very much for watching, though, and until next time, game on.